Hi, my name is Michael Schutz, and I'm an associate professor of music cognition and percussion at McMaster University. Over the past 15 years, I've had the honor and privilege of teaching music perception to hundreds, if not thousands, of students, both at McMaster and at some other universities where I've been affiliated. And I've had a chance to work with both psychology students and music students and found that when trying to teach some basic concepts of music perception, there's certain tools I would love to have at my disposal that weren't currently available. So to try and help with that, I created a new software tool that I find is really helpful in trying to teach some of the basics of what I find so exciting and interesting about musical sounds. So I'm really pleased to be able to share that with you today. And if you'd like to use this tool in your own courses, I'd be happy to talk with you more and give you the information about downloading it because it's free and it's something that should work cross-platform. So in order to give you an introduction to this, I wanted to invite as a virtual guest, Maxwell, who is an undergraduate student years ago and helped to do the heavy lifting on putting this tool together.
From the splash screen, we select the Spectra module. From here, we can play a series of standard sounds. The first is a simple sine wave, which has been pre-selected here. We play it by pressing the play button. And in addition to its audio, we can see multiple visualizations, including its spectra, two oscilloscope views, and its position on a keyboard representation. The two oscilloscopes represent its time frame in a more zoomed in view for its periodicity, and its amplitude envelope in a more zoomed out view. We can stop the sound by pressing the play button again. In addition to the sine wave, we have square waves, triangle waves, and sawtooth waves. As you'll note, as each of these sounds is changed, the sliders on the left change as well. These represent the intensities of each of the harmonics of the sound. For example, in the sine wave, only the first fundamental is being played, whereas in the square wave and the triangle wave, the odd harmonics are being played, and in the sawtooth waves, all harmonics are being played. You'll notice in the bottom right corner here that the relative intensity of each harmonic towards the fundamental is calculated. We can exit this module by pressing the home button.
So I found this to be really, really helpful in bringing to life some of the basics about different kinds of waves that textbooks give good introductory descriptions of. One of the great things about this is because it's a tool that I can play around with in real time in class, as students ask questions, you get new ideas and come across different points of confusion, I can quickly and easily cook up different examples in real time to show them how different principles play out. And because it's freely available, students can even download this and play around with synthesizing sounds on their own. So that's the first thing I find very helpful about this. The second thing connects with some of the research that my team is doing now, looking at the importance of temporal structure in sounds. I think traditionally we do a very good job about talking about the spectral structure of sounds, and you saw some of that in that last screen. And this translates nicely into a discussion about musical sounds. So one common thing that will be explained in textbooks or in classes is that the difference between a clarinet and a trumpet can be seen fairly easily in a power spectrum, where we can see that the clarinet produces energy at odd harmonics, whereas the trumpet has energy happening at all of these harmonics. And while that's true, I think this also leaves out something that's important and underemphasizes the crucial role that temporal changes in these harmonics play in how these sounds come across. Because if they say seeing is believing, for me, I think hearing is believing. And so I synthesize these power spectra to give us some insight into what they're actually doing when we're saying that these are the kinds of representations of sounds that are accurate. While that captures something about the difference between a clarinet and a trumpet, it's a far cry from the sound of an actual trumpet, which is what this power spectra was based on. So a few years ago in class, I started trying to present some different formats of figures where, in addition to the power spectra, I showed some temporal information about how these power spectra changed over time. I found this was really helpful in bringing some of these sound principles to life. And then by synthesizing these, I realized we actually get sounds that are much more lifelike than just those power spectra alone. I think that gets a lot closer to the sound of the original trumpet. Now, I'm not claiming this insight about the importance of these temporal changes is something shocking or new. I mean, acousticians were publishing about this several decades ago. Nonetheless, it seems to get overlooked in a lot of basic auditory perception and even music perception literature. And I think part of the reason for that has to do with the way we're teaching it in classes. So one of the core features I wanted to make sure we had in Maestro was the ability to show the importance of these temporal changes when it comes to musical sounds. So I'll show you a demonstration of that now.
From the splash screen, we select the Spectra module. Here we can explore a variety of musical instrument sounds. First, we select instruments from the drop-down menu. As you'll note, the instrument's play button has now disappeared, and that's because sounds are now played directly by pressing the buttons below. For example, here's a violin sound. When a sound is played, it is visualized on the Spectra, oscilloscope views, and its position on the keyboard below. In its oscilloscope views, we have one with a more zoomed-in timescale to show its periodicity, and one with a more zoomed-out timescale to show its amplitude envelope. There are 4 rows available. The top row allows us to select the instrument, such as strings, brass, woodwinds, percussion, and other instruments such as piano and guitar. On the bottom, as previously showed, we can play the audio recording of a selected instrument. You'll notice that it's very rich as it has many complex features to it. We can also, on the contrast, play its power spectrum. Instruments are often thought of as represented by their power spectrum, which we have here. This is based on average, and it gives some understanding, but does not create all the changes or all the complex features of a sound. On the opposite end, we have its dynamic spectrum, which includes the dynamic changes of the intensities of that sound over time. We can exit the Spectra module by clicking the Home button.
I find those piano representations of the sound to be particularly helpful in clarifying how the frequency information is falling from a musical perspective, and also how it's changing over time. And I find for the music students as well, that makes a big difference in getting them to understand the importance of these concepts. Now we can see just how important the temporal structure is if we look at this other example. So in a paper that we have under review now, we're looking at the difference between things like a trombone and a cello. And we look at this from the perspective of the power spectra, you can see they look almost identical. Now, you've probably rarely confused the trombone and the cello when listening to music. And the reason is that from a temporal perspective, the way these different components are behaving differs significantly when we look at the temporal dimension. And so this is one example of just how crucial that temporal information is. There's situations where looking only at the power spectra can actually mislead about the degree to which instruments appear similar. Now, if you're at this conference, you probably have a deep enough understanding of how instruments produce sound that these things might not be all that surprising. But put yourself in the shoes of students who have never had a chance to study these concepts before. If we're not clear about the importance of temporal structure in sound, that can lead to a situation where it goes entirely overlooked. And unfortunately, that's exactly what we see when we look at the research literature. So if you think about the diverse nature of musical sounds, you can see there's a wide range of complexity, but they're all complex in their own way. This is part of why I think musical sounds are so interesting. Now we can use the same perspective to look at what I call the flat tone. This is the sharp onset offset tone that seems very common in auditory perception studies. And when we graph it out using the same kind of representation, you can see it's almost like comically a world away from the kind of complexity that we see in musical sounds. Why does that really matter? Well, my team did a survey of 1,000 auditory experiments, and we found that most of these experiments use those simple sounds like I have for that flat tone in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, the problem with this is it's such a simple stimulus that it doesn't actually trigger the same kinds of perceptual processes that we use when listening to musical sounds. So we've shown in a number of examples, we can actually get fundamentally different outcomes from experiments when we're using sounds that are simple, like that one in the lower right, versus more temporally complex. In other words, sounds closer to music. So if we want to conduct music perception research in a way that informs our understanding about how music works, I think it's really important as a discipline, we think more about the kinds of sounds that we're using in our experiments. And to some extent, I think that starts with the kind of pedagogical approaches we're using to teach about sound in our introductory courses. So I think this is a really important issue, and I'm pleased to announce that this software is now available freely to anyone. If you go to maplelab.net/pedagogy, we have a series of tools that I've developed for use in teaching, including Maestro. It's essentially a GUI that sits on top of Super Collider, but you don't need to understand or do any programming to create the sounds. So because it's an intuitive interface, I find it's helpful in explaining these things, showing demos in class, and allowing students to create their own sounds. We're actually even using it now in my lab to create the stimuli for certain experiments that we're running to explore how we can use temporal structure in important ways. So I just wanted to first acknowledge Maxwell's role in putting this tool together. I think it was an incredible project for an undergraduate student, and many students at the university are still benefiting from that, and also the funding agencies that make this work possible. If you're interested in more information about Maestro or our work, I encourage you to follow my team on Facebook and or Twitter. And as one exciting announcement you'll get news about if you follow us there, pretty soon there will be a new talk on the TED site where I'm giving about the importance of temporal complexity in sounds and talking not only about how this is important for research, but how it actually has some important implications in the kinds of sounds we use in medical devices and hospitals. Where overlooking the importance of temporal structure has actually led to the deaths of 566 patients, according to an FDA survey. So hopefully they got your attention and you're interested in checking out that talk as well as downloading your own copy of the software. So thank you so much for listening, and thanks to the organizers for putting together this very challenging but very interesting conference. I'd be happy to answer your questions now.